Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with LA-based award-winning saxophonist and composer Alex Hahn. He reached out to the show, and we are glad he did. He talked about his new 2021 CD, Second Wind, featuring all new original music inspired by jazz, funk, rock, pop, fusion, and modern production. Still early in his career, he has had the opportunity to perform with many renowned artists like Herbie Hancock, Esperanza Spalding, Bob Mintzer, and the great John Daversa. He also recorded on Michael Bublé's last two albums, and he's got some solid brass already. He's a six-time Downbeat Magazine Award winner and winner of the 2019 Michael Brecker International Saxophone Competition held at the Red Sea Jazz Festival. His story is a great one, still unfolding. Enjoy.
Thanks for reaching out.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So let's go ahead and dive right in here. I think at the top of this, you have a new project that is out, and I want to know from you, it's called Second Wind. Talk to me a little bit about, before we get into the kind of the artistic construction of this project, you know, we were on the tail end of a pandemic. I don't know where we're at now, but,
right.
You know, things are still at least somewhat in a better place. What does it mean for you to be able to release this album during this time when communication with the fans has been so limited?
This is one of the most, exciting records of mine because it's my fourth album, and I'm so excited about it because of that, because of things are starting to look a little bit better. More people are starting to get the vaccine, and it's getting a little bit closer to being normal. And that's really what this whole record was about, was like, I was so unmotivated and I felt so uncreative sitting at home all this time that, Second Wind was me getting this second wind of creativity and forcing myself to write all this music and feel creative again and force myself to kind of get back to normal and start practicing again and start composing again. And I had this wave of creative energy, over last summer, and that's kind of where all this whole album kind of started.
You have all these elements of jazz, funk, pop, rock, fusion, and modern elements. How did all of this come together? I mean, everybody has their own voice, but how did this voice evolve into the sound that you have on this album?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think number one, this is where jazz is now. You look at artists like Kamasi Washington, Herbie Hancock, Snarky Puppy. Like, jazz has never meant, one thing, but especially now, there's so many collaborations with hip-hop and rappers and, all of these different stylistic things that, to me, makes jazz so great, is all of these different styles kind of melded into one. So that's definitely part of it. But in terms of me personally, I've always loved smooth jazz. I've always loved R&B. I've always loved Earth, Wind, and Fire. I've always loved, Ray Charles. I've always loved a bunch of artists that weren't jazz musicians. And along with studying the Charlie Parkers and the Cannonball Adderleys and the Miles Davises, I've studied a lot of non-jazz too. And so that influences the way that I compose, the way that I improvise. I'm having all these influences from all these different places.
What do you hope the listener gets from this project? What do you want them to feel? How do you want them to go about listening to this?
That's a good question. I hope they hear the energy, number one. As I mentioned, the Second Wind was like this reemergence of all this creativity that I felt none of during the pandemic when I was sitting at home all that time. So I hope they feel energy, and I hope this gives them energy to be excited about music, to be excited about the pandemic slowly getting a little bit better and a little bit better. And I think that two of the most important things that I think about in my own music is groove and melody. And with those two things, I think that connects with a lot of different people. I know that, my favorite melodies come from Disney movies. They come from, John Williams, and that is something that I've always connected with, is good melodies. And when you have a good groove with a good melody, to me, that's a winning combination. So I hope they hear some groove. I hope they hear some melodies that they like, something they can dance to, something they can vibe to. And then I hope they hear the energy that the band brought on the record.
The one thing that you mentioned, too, is that there's this evolving sound in the world of jazz. And I think that's very important, not only for, the fact that things have to change. Things do evolve. And I've noticed a lot more electronica happening in jazz lately. So my question to you is this. How strong do you think jazz is? I used to ask this question prior to the pandemic. How strong is jazz? I never have to ask that again because the amount of shows that were canceled by everybody was staggering. But I think I'm talking more about like girth and integrity of this craft, this idiom. And I'm wondering from your perspective, how strong is it? You're in LA. There's a good scene out there. How vital and vibrant is it?
Well, I think especially in Los Angeles, there are so many people in my generation and younger, and even people a little bit older, the generation of jazz musicians above me, who have moved from New York, who have come to LA and started to play a bunch of creative music. I feel like LA used to be this place where it was just like studio musicians lived and all the recordings and all the albums and all the movies were done here. But now there's such a vital, creative energy with a bunch of young people doing really, really cool, interesting music. And there's a lot of cool venues. Sam First comes to mind as a new venue that's run by LAX that's constantly having young people share their new creative music. So I think that in terms of Los Angeles, it's actually super happening right now. I have so many friends who, are doing super interesting projects and really exploring, all elements of jazz. And I think the other thing about that too is like jazz is so important because of how it's just as I mentioned, jazz has taken influences from other genres. I mean, jazz has influenced, pop music, and jazz has influenced R&B with the harmonies. And, you can hear jazz in almost any style of music because of harmonies, because of melodies, because of, improvisation, because of all those elements. So it's definitely an important art form, and it's America's art form. So super important to me, at least.
Everyone has their gateway drug, their entry flashpoint, so to speak, of jazz. How did this happen for you? Talk to me a little bit about your childhood. Are you originally from LA, and how did it all begin for you?
Sure. So both my parents are musicians. My dad's a saxophone player and clarinetist. He played lead alto for Glenn Miller's band back in the 80s. He did a couple of tours with them. And then my mom's a classically trained pianist, and she teaches music therapy. They actually just both retired. They're both music educators as well. My mom taught music therapy at a special ed school for 35 years, and my dad taught middle school band and orchestra and choir and all that stuff for 35 years. So definitely in my blood. I mean, we listen to records all the time, and what's great about their taste is they love James Taylor, they love Earth, Wind & Fire, as I previously mentioned, they love Tower of Power, and so we always had, good music kind of playing in the house, and it was such a big part of our community because my dad was, the local band director, so everybody knew me as the band director's kid, and that was actually super annoying, and that's why I didn't want to be a musician for the longest time because I had this association with being like my parents. And it wasn't really until senior year of high school where I kind of decided hey, I'm pretty good at this and I really love doing this. And that's when the college stuff happened and from there.
So talk to me a little bit about the first jazz show that blew you away, that made you think, what?
Not the first jazz show I saw, but one of the first times I performed where I felt like, oh my gosh, I have to do this for the rest of my life, was my high school. When I was a senior in high school, our band got chosen to perform at the Playboy Jazz Festival, open the festival, and I had a bunch of solos in front of the band where I was being featured. And so here I am, a senior in high school, and backstage is Chick Corea, rest in peace, Kenny Garrett, Brian Play, all of my favorite, musicians, and here I am, this little high schooler going up on stage, and having that stage, turn around, and there's thousands and thousands of people and me playing a solo and hearing the audience reaction. And I mean, I'm still kind of chasing that high, I guess, of performing for people who are excited about the music and who love the music. That's such a cool venue, the Hollywood Bowl. And so, yeah, that was my first taste of performing. Yeah, that's a feeling that I absolutely love.
You have been around some big names in the world of jazz, from Esperanza Spalding, Bob Mintzer, John Daversa. There's been a lot of names. What have you learned from these musicians that you, in turn, have not only used to fuel your career, but to teach younger musicians that you get around?
Well, I would say one of the most important and influential people that I've been around is Herbie Hancock, and I've got to play with him a bunch and talk with him a bunch. Over the pandemic, we've talked on the phone probably 3 or 4 times where we have these 40, 50-minute conversations, and it's pretty mind-blowing that, number one, I have him as my contact on my phone. But number two, that he takes the time to really talk, and we can, I can ask him questions, and he can tell me stories. But when I was working with him at the Thelonious Monk Institute, he really opened up my eyes and ears to, relating music to the real world, and not just making music for the people, not just making music for, your friends and playing with your friends, but making it for audiences and relating, the story of your compositions to what's happening in real life. And I never really thought that before. I had, released a couple albums before I had met Herbie, and, it was just about like, oh yeah, I really like this melody, or oh yeah, I really like this chord progression, or oh, I want to add these strings because it sounds really cool. And, so much of my compositional process has now been, how can I relate this to what's happening in the world? How can I really tell a story with this music? How can I really relate this to, something that, thousands of people can also relate to? It's not just about me, it's about connecting with the audience. I think about that so much with my composition and my improvisation, of really connecting to people and telling a story and, letting the real world, whether it's politics or whether it's, anything that's happening in the real world, influence me in terms of my artistic vision.
So every day you get to wake up, you're a professional musician, you get to create. What do you like the best about being a professional musician?
Good question. Well, for me, my brain is kind of like ADD, where it's like always moving at a million miles per hour. Why I can't sleep at night, which is a whole other conversation that we can have. My favorite thing is like every day is not the same. I could have a gig in Beverly Hills one night, or I'm playing a recording session in the morning, and then I got to go teach, and then I got to do this. And I love that not every day is the same. And I love that, there's opportunities, especially in Los Angeles, in so many different styles of music and so many different ways to express myself in terms of composition, in terms of recordings, in terms of teaching, in terms of styles of music. There's so much variety here in Los Angeles. I can't imagine living anywhere else, because I love that every day is different. I can play different styles of music. I can play as many different things as I possibly want. So I love the variety. And obviously it's a hustle, and it's a lot of hard work, but to me it's 1,000% worth it.
So in your career, too, you've gotten some brass, you've gotten some good recognition. And I don't want to know what your favorite award has been, but what was one that you won or recognition that you got that just surprised you, threw you for a loop?
Oh, good question. The biggest and the most important, I guess, to side answer your question, was the Michael Brecker International Saxophone Competition, which was run by Susan Brecker, who was Michael Brecker's widow. That really surprised me because of, number one, how many people auditioned for it, and how much, Michael Brecker has meant to me. He was one of my very first favorite saxophone players. When I first started listening to him when I was in high school, he had already passed away, so I had no connection to seeing him live or getting to meet him. And I have so many older friends and mentors and teachers who either played with him or talked with him, and I had that connection that way. But again, when I first learned about him, he had already passed, and so I had this really deep connection of listening to him and learning from him and transcribing him and playing along with his records. And he has been such an integral part of my own artistic playing in terms of the saxophone. Even being a semifinalist, the top 8 in that competition was an incredible honor. And then to fly to the Red Sea Jazz Festival in Israel and fly halfway across the globe and be a part of this, and then be named one of 3 finalists, and then to end up winning the competition when Kenny Garrett and Donnie McCaslin and Ron Carter were the judges, was like completely mind-blowing. And it was an incredible honor because of, again, how much Michael Brecker has meant to me. And my goal when I first entered the competition was, if I make the top 8, if I'm an 8th semifinalist and get to fly to Israel, play at the Red Sea Jazz Festival, that's good enough. And then to, have those expectations be met and exceeded was truly, truly an honor. Again, Susan has been so nice to me, so grateful to me, and so helpful to all of us who were there. But again, just to be the tiniest part of Michael Brecker's legacy really, really means a lot to me.
And this question, I may be able to presume how you would answer it, but I'm just going to ask it outright. If we get off the phone, a Jazz DeLorean pulls up in front of your house, you can punch in the digits, go anywhere, any place. see anybody in the annals of jazz live, who are you going to go see? Who would you want to talk to after the show?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Do I have to pick one, or can I pick multiple?
You can pick a few. That's fine.
Okay, so, well, first I would love to talk to Charlie Parker because his personality, he seemed like quite the character, drugs aside, obviously. So I'd love to talk to Charlie Parker and hear what he really practiced. I've read about him a bunch. I've read a few books about him and stuff. But to really dive into the things that he thought about, the way that he thought about the music, how he kind of derived this whole bebop style would be completely mind-blowing. And then number two, I would say Miles Davis. Miles Davis, similarly to Herbie Hancock, which is where Herbie got all this stuff from, evolved so many times as an artist, starting to play with Charlie Parker and play bebop, and then changing the face of jazz like 5 or 6 times throughout his career. To me, that is what the masters of jazz have done, is constantly think forward, constantly evolve their music. Is no album is the same. And to be able to talk to him about, how he progressed as an artist, how he thought about the music differently, how he, thought about composition, or play with him. I don't know how much of a talker he would actually get to play with him. And yes, obviously Miles and Berg.
When we do return to music in earnest and it really, really ramps up, what do you hope we all realize about the power of live music when it comes back?
I hope we realize how important it is and how much we missed it and not to take it for granted anymore. And I know in the few recording sessions and gigs that I've had thus far, I try not to take them for granted anymore. Like, oh yeah, here's this, $50 gig up in Hollywood and, you're playing this, like, that can be a drag sometimes. But to be like, hey, I get to play live music. I get to make a living doing this stuff. And, I get to hear this band, or, I get to hear my best friend, or, I get to hear this. Like, I just hope we, again, not take it as much for granted. And I hope we realize how special it is and how much it's needed to have live music, to hear live music, because there's nothing like it. Recordings can't do it justice.
Everyone has a perception or an idea of who they think you are, your family, your friends, your fans, but ultimately, you live your life. What's your perception of who you think you are? Or who do you think you are?
Wow, that's a deep question. I would say, and this may sound kind of weird, I feel like I'm pretty normal. A lot of friends that I have who are musicians, I feel like they're so brilliant and so incredible at their art, whether they're composers, arrangers, improvisers, that I'm so in awe of what they're able to do musically that I feel like that's a level above me. And so when I compare myself to them, not in a hurtful way, but just as a, comparative way, I just feel pretty normal. And I feel like the music I create, my compositional, what I think about compositionally, what I think about in terms of improvisations, is geared towards, not just jazz musicians, but to, normal people. And so I think a lot about that in my music and a lot about that in my personality. I'm just, I guess I just feel like a normal person who happens to be pretty good at the saxophone.
That's great. That's a great answer. And I saved the hardest one for the very last one. So, Alex, hey, thanks again for reaching out. Thanks for taking some time out. I look forward to playing your music on Neon Jazz.
Oh, thanks, Joe. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for calling.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Los Angeles, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Alex for his time, music, and story. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.